In August of 2014, a 35-year-old hiker from Washington, D.C., Clara Mitchell, went on a 4-day hike in Glacier National Park in Montana. She was supposed to return on August 17th, but never showed up. 10 years passed. It was only in the summer of 2024 that a glacier melting on the slopes of Mount Siyeh revealed a secret that left even experienced rescuers speechless. On August 15, 2014, the Glacier National Park greeted the dawn with fog and silence. The air was cool, smelling of tar and cold water flowing from the glaciers. 2 rangers were on duty at the Main Meadows campsite, registering hikers who were going on a hike. One of them was Clara Mitchell, a 35-year-old resident of Washington State. She signed the log at 7 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, noting the route: a 4-day hike to Iceberg Lake, then through the Bird Tunnel Trail toward the remote Bellingham Creek Valley. Clara drove herself. Her gray Subaru SUV was parked neatly at the trailhead, with all her gear neatly stowed in the trunk. She was experienced in backpacking, worked as a landscape designer, and often traveled alone. Her colleagues in Seattle recalled that before she left, she said, "I want silence. I want to see the mountains without people." That morning, the weather seemed calm. The clouds clung to the peaks, but did not portend anything dangerous. Tourists leaving the camp that day remembered Clara a slender woman in a light jacket with a camera over her shoulder. She was smiling, thanking the ranger, and heading up the trail between the spruce trees. The road to Iceberg Lake was considered one of the most scenic in the park. It stretched for 8 miles through coniferous forests, past rocky outcroppings and small waterfalls. Clara stopped frequently, capturing everything on camera: the sun breaking through the branches, icy streams, reflections on the stones. The footage that would later be found in her camera's memory shows her climbing up to an open plateau where snow goats graze. This is the last time she was seen alive. Around noon, a group of tourists descending to meet her recalled her figure on the slope, lonely but calm. One of them, a retiree from Minnesota, later said during questioning, "She looked like she knew where she was going. She was standing there filming a goat on a rock. We even waved to her." After 3 o'clock, the sky suddenly darkened. According to the observations of the weather station in the valley, the pressure dropped sharply and a storm band appeared over the ridges. This was unusual for August. The temperature dropped below zero, and instead of rain, it started to snow. The rangers warned the groups about the bad weather on the radio, but the signal was disappearing in the mountain valleys. By late afternoon, visibility dropped to a few dozen yards, and the wind began to blow down small trees. At the campsite where Clara was to return in 4 days, no one was worried until the evening. Such hikes often took a long time, and experienced travelers often stayed a day longer. Only later would the rangers recall that there was a strange smell in the wind that night, a mixture of smoke and cold wax, as if a beehive was burning. When the other tourists came down to the parking lot on the morning of August 17th, the gray Subaru was still there, covered with a thin layer of snow. The door was locked. Inside were a bottle of water, some food, a cell phone with no signal, and a note in a notebook. Day 1. The weather is perfect. Tomorrow, through the tunnel. In the pictures from the camera found nearby, the last series of photos was taken at about 5 in the evening of August 15th. They show a steep snow-covered pass, a cliff, and a flock of goats against a background of gray rocks. Then, nothing. When a blizzard started over the mountains that evening, with winds gusting up to 40 miles per hour, one of the rangers jokingly said, "Even the bears are hiding today." But the joke was inappropriate, for somewhere in that white silence, Clara Mitchell took her last step and disappeared, leaving behind only her journal entries and boot prints, which were covered by snow within an hour. On August 17, 2014, when Clara was supposed to return, the campground at Main Meadows did not raise the alarm at first. Hikers were often delayed in the mountains because of bad weather or fatigue. But when the evening passed and her car remained in the parking lot, the Rangers contacted the park administration. The next morning, they officially launched a search operation. The weather remained difficult, the snow was thick, and the sky was overcast. Tracks that could indicate the direction of travel disappeared under the new snow. Two teams of rangers set out in two directions, along the Iceberg Lake Trail and across the pass to the bird tunnel. They moved slowly, checking every ledge, every crevice, where a traveler could hide from the storm. But there was only white emptiness around, swallowing sounds and smells. On the third day, the Air Force was brought in. A helicopter took off from the base in Columbia Falls and spent several hours flying over slopes, canyons, and frozen streams. From the air, the rescuers could only see gray ridges and collapsed patches of snow covering the trails. On the northern slope of the bird tunnel, they noticed a dark spot, something that looked like a piece of cloth. The team went down there on foot. At the foot of the cliff, a burnt piece of photo paper lay nailed to the stone by the wind. On it was a blurred image of a snow goat, the one Clara had photographed the last time. The edges were charred, as if the photo had been caught in a fire and then dried by the cold. This photo was the only proof that she had actually reached the pass. The search lasted day and night. The Rangers divided the area into sectors: Bellingham Creek Valley, the eastern slope of Mount Grinnell, and the Siyeh Glacier. In each sector, they worked in turn with dogs, with thermal imagers, with maps of old routes. But the weather conditions were merciless. The temperature dropped below freezing, the wind cut the skin, and the ice cracked underfoot. Several volunteers suffered frostbite. On the fifth day, volunteers from neighboring districts joined the search. Among them was former rescuer Bob Hendricks, who had known the area since childhood. He would later tell journalists, "We walked from dawn to dusk. There was a smell of moisture and something else in the air. Old wax. At the time, I thought it was just from the fires, but now I'm not sure." Meanwhile, Clara's family arrived in Montana. Her brother helped coordinate the search teams, coming to the headquarters near Swan Lake every day. In the evening, he would sit on a bench in front of the fireplace and look at a map with red markers marking the areas they had covered. Every day the lines became thicker, but there was no result. The dogs, which in the early days still picked up a faint trail of her belongings, later lost their bearings. One of the dog handlers said in a report, "The smell stops near the tunnel. Then there is silence, as if the wind had licked it away." On August 20th, another storm hit the park. The helicopters could not take off, and the search teams returned to the base. At night, the temperature dropped to -10 degrees Celsius, and even the campfires went out because of the snow. Only short reports were heard on the radio. The sector is clear. Visibility is 0. In late August, the search was reduced to checking cliffs and glacial cracks. The Rangers lowered cameras into the crevasses, throwing light beacons down. All the recordings showed the same thing: ice, stone, silence. No sign of bodies or things. On September 1st, the headquarters officially reduced the number of patrols. Volunteers were allowed to go home. Only a few people remained, stubborn, exhausted, but not ready to stop. They combed the slopes for a few more days until the snow covered everything. When a document was signed on September 12th to end the active search, the report stated, "Probable death from hypothermia. The body has not been found." The case was officially classified as missing. Clara's gray Subaru remained parked in the parking lot at the beginning of the trail for a long time. It was not touched. The family asked to leave it. In the winter, snow completely covered the car, and in the spring, it was opened again as if nothing had happened. Tourists who came to the glacier saw it and asked the Rangers why it was there. The answer was always the same: the owner didn't come back. That was the end of the first stage of the search. The mountains kept their silence, and a burnt photograph of a snow goat was the only proof that Clara Mitchell really existed among this white silence. The fall of 2014 brought early frosts to Montana. When snow finally closed the trails in the Iceberg Lake area, the search for Clara Mitchell was officially over. The National Park Service report was a dry record. Missing, probable death due to hypothermia. For her family, this was not an answer. Her brother, Stephen Mitchell, left his job in Seattle and came to Montana. For several weeks, he hiked the trails by himself, talking to rangers and tourists who were in the mountains at the time. Everyone kept saying the same thing. The storm had come suddenly, and if Clara was on the pass, she had no chance of returning. But Stephen didn't believe it. His words were filled with the stubbornness familiar to those who do not accept emptiness. When a person disappears, there must be something, even a crumb. In November, the family hired a private investigator, Harold Webb, a former Missoula investigator. He specialized in wilderness disappearances and had a reputation for not stopping to look at the smallest detail. Webb's first order of business was to review all of the case files, ranger reports, weather reports, search maps, and witness interviews. He was interested in details that might seem unnoticeable: the location of the found photo, the wind direction, the distance between the trails. He came to the conclusion that the storm could have driven Clara off the main route and to the side, to the area of old caves at the foot of Mount Sister. But it was impossible to check this in winter. In February of 2015, he returned to the park when the roads were still covered with snow. Together with a local guide, he examined several ravines and glacial crevasses. Everything was in vain. They found no belongings, no clothes, no traces of a fire. It was as if the person had simply vanished. Then the first versions appeared. The police insisted on an accident. Clara could have stumbled and fallen into a gorge where her body was covered with snow. Another hypothesis was an attack by a wild animal. In that region, brown grizzly bears were often seen descending into the valleys in search of food. However, experts from the Fisheries and Wildlife Service had their doubts. After an attack, a predator always leaves traces: fur, blood, and the remains of equipment. There was nothing here. Webb continued to dig deeper. He visited the archives of the University of Great Falls, where old maps of the area, created in the early 20th century, were kept. They marked several disappeared settlements, including a small camp with the strange name Rock Guardians. Nearby was a sign, the site of old Blackfoot ceremonies. The detective began to collect oral histories. Old hunters and descendants of Indians from the reservation said that once upon a time, a small brotherhood really lived in these mountains, making sacrifices to the spirits to calm the weather. They were called the Keepers of the Rock. According to legend, they believed that storms are the wrath of the mountains, which can only be stopped by the gift of a pure soul. Every night they lit wax candles at the entrance to the caves, and when the ice melted, the wind seemed to calm down. It sounded like a myth to Webb, but some of the details alarmed him. One of the elders said, "Those who saw their light never returned." Another added, "The mountains take those who listen too closely." The report that the detective handed over to the family in the spring of 2015 contained nothing concrete, only a suggestion. If Clara came across old caves or descendants of those who once lived there, she might not have died of cold. The police took these words as an attempt to keep the order. Officially, the case remained inactive. Years passed. In 2016, the family sold Clara's house in Seattle, but did not close the bank account in the hope that she would turn up one day. Her name appeared several times in the databases as a possible match. A tourist with the same hair color was seen in Utah, then in Colorado. Each check ended the same way. It wasn't her. In 2019, Harold Webb retired, but continued to write about old cases. In one of his interviews, he mentioned Clara. Her case is the purest mystery. When there is no body, there is not even death. There is only the silence of the mountains. 10 years have passed without change. A dossier titled Mitchell Clara, Missing Person was in the archive of the county police among hundreds of others. Yellowed paper on the cover, a layer of dust on the shelf. Only her family brought flowers to Swan Lake every August, where her car was last seen. Thus, Clara Mitchell's case became another cold story, part of statistics, where numbers replace faces and legends become the only explanation for what defies understanding. The mountains were silent, as they always were, and under their ice, perhaps, there was already a truth waiting for them that no one was in a hurry to find. On July 12, 2024, 3 cave climbers from the Geoclimate North research team were working in the area of Mount Sister, north of the Silla Glacier. Their task was simple and mundane, to measure the rate of ice melt and record new watercourses that appeared during the abnormal summer. This year's melting rate was considered the highest in a decade. The average temperature rose so much that old layers of ice that had not moved for centuries began to sink. This opened the way to new cavities that had previously been under the ice. The group was led by an experienced researcher, 40-year-old Mark Reynolds, a former military climber. He was accompanied by a graduate student from Helena, Rebecca Stone, and a field technician, Noah Woods. They arrived the day before, spent the night in tents at the foot, and in the morning headed to the northeastern slope, where a drone had recorded a dip in the ice surface the day before. At about 11 o'clock in the morning, Reynolds was the first to approach the edge of the crack. It resembled a narrow well that went deep into the ice at an angle of 45 degrees. It was dark inside, but the sound of dripping came from below, which meant that water was flowing somewhere down there. According to preliminary calculations, the depth was about 20 yards. After a short meeting, they decided to go down. Noah set up a safety harness, secured the rope to a steel pin, and Reynolds began the descent. The walls of the well were smooth, sparkling in the sun like glass. In some places, the ice was so transparent that dark cavities shone through it, as if someone had lined long corridors underground. When Reynolds reached the bottom, he shouted up, "There's a cave here! A big one!" His voice echoed off the walls and sounded unnaturally deaf. Inside, a natural hall opened up a grotto with a domed ceiling and crystalline walls. In the center was a thin stream of melted water, which collected in a puddle near a stone ledge. The air was frozen, heavy, and had a strange, sweet smell. Rebecca, following the leader, immediately felt her breath fogging up inside her mask. "Like wax," she said later in her report. The light from the lanterns reflected off the walls, casting stains on the floor. They walked forward, stepping carefully over shards of stone. A few yards from the entrance, the grotto widened, forming an almost regular circle. And it was there that Reynolds stopped. A stone altar stood before him. At first glance, it looked like a natural block of slate, but the surface was too smooth, as if it had been polished by hand. The dust that should have covered it after thousands of years of dormancy was absent. The altar shone as if it had been recently wiped down. On it lay something that at first appeared to be a stone statue. Rebecca approached, shone her flashlight on it, and froze. It was a human body. The woman was lying on her back, arms folded across her chest, fingers closed as if in prayer. The skin was pale, almost transparent, stretched over the bones, but not decomposed. It was covered with a thick layer of hardened wax, giving the impression of a translucent shroud. The hair, dark and tangled, stuck to the stone. Around her neck was a thin rope with a dried snow goat feather. "It's a woman," Rebecca whispered. Her voice trembled, and the sound echoed through the grotto. Reynolds leaned over the body without touching it. Strange things were lying nearby, right on the stone. Wooden figures, carved roughly, almost primitively, each with horns or hooves. Several stone plates with carvings that resembled spirals. A bundle of feathers, gathered in a heap and tied with a rope of dry herbs. On one of the walls next to the altar, a black drawing was darkening, a circle with a cross in the middle, made, it seemed, with charcoal or soot. Rebecca took out her camera and started recording. On the video, which would later become evidence, she is heard saying, "This is not just a body. Someone prepared it. It's like a ritual." Noah, standing further away, asked if it could be an ancient burial site. Reynolds shook his head. The wax composition looked fresh, with no signs of age-related crystallization. In addition, there were no fragments of cloth or funerary equipment around that accompanied traditional rites. Everything looked too complete, too deliberate. He came closer, and in the light of the lantern he could see a face. It was surprisingly well preserved, closed eyes, slightly parted lips, with a frozen expression of peace. The ages had not managed to distort the features. The air was filled with the scent of honey and smoke, a smell that could not be confused with anything else. After a few minutes of silence, Reynolds ordered them to the surface and call the authorities. The radio was barely picking up a signal, so Noah went upstairs, leaving his two colleagues in the cave. When the connection was established, the base in Columbia Falls first thought it was a mistake. Then they relayed the message to the Flathead County Sheriff. While they waited, Rebecca couldn't take her eyes off the wax body. It seemed to her that when the lantern moved, the woman's face changed too. The shadow slid across her cheeks, and for a moment, you would think she was breathing. "Maybe it's a fake," she said quietly. "No," Reynolds replied, not looking up. "This is someone they wanted to keep alive." He took a thermometer and measured the surface temperature. The wax was hard, but warmer than the stone underneath, as if there was a faint heat transfer from within. It couldn't be a coincidence. Either the composition had unique properties, or the body hadn't been lying there that long. 2 hours later, when the sheriff's helicopter appeared over the glacier, the sun was already tending to set. The wind in the narrow well was humming like an organ. The climbers, sitting at the entrance, waited for the rescuers to descend. Rebecca wrote the last line in her field journal. "Find at a depth of 20 yards, a human body covered in wax. Ritual objects nearby. The place looks like a sanctuary. The atmosphere is silence, as if time stands still." When the rescuers entered the cave, they too became silent. The flashlights shone on the smooth stone, and the glitter of the wax reflected in the visors. One of the men, unable to stand it, whispered, "God." The altar stood in the center of the grotto, as if on display for those who dared to find it. And even through thousands of feet of stone, it seemed that this cold honey smelled alive. When the body, found in a cave under Mount Sister, was brought to the surface, a helicopter with a sealed capsule immediately flew to the forensic laboratory in Helena. The find was accompanied by the sheriff of Flathead County and one of the researchers, Mark Reynolds. Everyone realized that this was not just another case of a tourist's death. The condition of the body was so abnormal that even experienced forensic scientists could not explain how it could have survived without any signs of decomposition. The experts worked all night. The body was placed in a special insulated chamber, the temperature of which was kept near zero. Wax covered everything from the hair to the fingertips. Under the lamps, it shone with a golden hue, as if it had just frozen. The first attempts to separate the top layer showed that the material was extremely dense, of natural origin, but with impurities of organic substances similar to pollen and propolis. This meant only one thing: beeswax, not industrial beeswax, but wild beeswax collected in the foothills, where rare species of honeybees live. At 10 in the morning the next day, forensic expert Dr. Henry Quinn began the initial examination. First, he checked the dentition. The Montana Missing Persons Database found a complete match to Clara Mitchell, who had disappeared 10 years earlier. The identification was confirmed 2 hours later, when the results of a rapid DNA test conducted on hair fragments removed from the wax came back. The match was 100%. The laboratory hall was filled with police, prosecutors, and journalists. For most of them, it was a sensation. The missing tourist, who was believed to have died in a snowstorm, was lying in front of them, preserved as if she had died yesterday. Dr. Quinn noted in his report, "The woman's body is extremely well preserved. The internal tissues show no signs of decay. The cardiovascular system is in a state of severe collapse, characteristic of hypothermia or prolonged exhaustion. No signs of violence were found. There were no fractures, cuts, or bruises. Death occurred naturally, probably as a result of cardiac arrest." But the real miracle was waiting inside. During the autopsy, when they began to carefully remove the wax from her hands, the experts found that Clara's fingers were tightly clutching a small object. It was pulled out slowly, so as not to damage the mold. In her palm was an amulet carved from the horn of a snow goat. The surface was polished and strange symbols stretched along the edges, unlike any known alphabets or ornaments of the Indian tribes of the region. They looked like a combination of sun signs, waves, and spirals, but with a repeating motif, a triangle with an eye engraved in the center. When the amulet was cleaned of wax, laboratory instruments recorded the remnants of old organic material, traces of pollen that did not match the composition of any modern Montana plant. Dr. Quinn suggested that the object could be ancient, possibly made several centuries ago. However, there was nothing of the kind in the archaeological databases. Anthropology experts who were called in for a consultation examined the object and shrugged their shoulders. One of them said, "This is not a thing of local tribes. The carving technique is completely different, but the material is definitely from Montana. It's the same type of horn that wild mountain goats have." The handwritten report contains a note from another expert. Perhaps the amulet was made by people who isolated themselves from civilization. It seems that this is not an artifact of the past, but a modern ritual object created deliberately for the rite of preservation. Under the layer of wax, no skin damage was found, only light scratches on the forearms, as if from contact with an icy surface. There were particles of pollen and wax flakes in his hair. The forensic expert noted that the wax was applied after death. The body temperature at the time of application was below the melting point of the wax. This excludes the possibility that the person was alive at the time of the coating. Toxicology results also showed no traces of poisoning or medication. Clara's body was completely clean, with no signs of violent action. However, the main mystery was not the cause of death, but the process of preservation. The wax soaked the skin, filled the pores, but did not damage the tissue. There were no signs of decomposition, even in the most vulnerable areas. Dr. Quinn acknowledged, "If I didn't know that the body had been there for at least 10 years, I would have said it had been dead for days." When the results of the tests were presented at a press conference, journalists asked questions that had no answers. How did the body get into the cave? Who could have applied the wax? And why were there objects that looked like ritualistic ones nearby? The sheriff of Flathead answered briefly, "We are dealing with a unique case, possibly human intervention after death. We are still considering all possibilities." Clara Mitchell's body was transported to the morgue under guard. The wax taken for samples was sent to a federal laboratory for deeper analysis, and the amulet was placed in an evidence safe as the only tangible clue to the mystery that awaited explanation. And although the official conclusion sounded simple, death without signs of violence, no one in the room believed in chance. The silence that stood around the altar in the cave now haunted everyone who touched the case of Clara Mitchell. The wax seemed to continue to hold her captive, protecting a story that could not be told in words. The investigation into Clara Mitchell's death was transferred to the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In early August of 2024, FBI Special Agent Jonathan Hale, a specialist in religious cults and disappearances in wilderness areas, arrived in Montana. He was invited after the case file contained references to ritual objects and a strange amulet with symbols that could not be attributed to any known culture. Hale started with a simple solution. He went to the site of the discovery with a group of forensic scientists and anthropologists. The cave in the Mount Sister area had already been sealed off and guarded around the clock, but the agent insisted on reopening it. He stayed inside for more than 2 hours, photographing every detail: the location of the altar, drawings on the walls, wooden figurines, the remains of a fireplace at the entrance. On the floor, he noticed something that other experts had not seen before: traces of candle wax melted and frozen again, as if dozens of small fires had once been burning here. After returning to the headquarters, he reviewed the archives of disappearance cases within the park over the past half-century. It turned out that within a 30-mile radius of Mount Sister, at least 7 people had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. All of them were loners, most of them women, who had gone into the mountains alone. The pattern repeated itself: summer, remote location, sudden storm. No bodies were found. Hale invited old-timers from nearby towns to talk. At a roadside cafe in the town of St. Mary's, he met an elderly shepherd named Milton Drake. He had lived in these mountains all his life. The old man spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if he were weighing whether to share what he knew. "Are you asking about them?" he finally said. "The ones we call the silent ones? You can't see them, but they are there. They do no harm if you do not interfere." When the agent asked him who exactly these silent ones were, the old man answered cryptically, "They have been here for a long time, even before there were roads. They are not monks or savages. They keep the mountains calm." The following days brought new evidence. 2 hunters from Kalispell said that a few years ago they came across a camp in a high mountain valley. The people there were wearing simple linen clothes, no shoes, and light headbands. When the hunters tried to approach, they were greeted in silence, only raising their hands with palms forward, a sign that looked like a warning. They called themselves guardians and asked them not to return. Hale began to piece it all together. In the old Forest Service archives, he came across yellowed documents from the early 20th century. They mentioned a religious community called the Order of Silence, which had settled in the mountains after a split in one of the Protestant sects. Its founder, former preacher Elias Gray, preached the idea of merging with the spirit of the rock. The community disappeared from official records in the 30s of the last century. The surviving records showed that Gray's followers believed that nature had its own will and that storms and avalanches were its wrath. The only way to appease it was to make a pure sacrifice, not by violence, but by the voluntary gift of life. Their dogma was as follows: "He who dies in silence keeps the light alive for those who survive." In the report, Hale noted, "It is possible that some of the community did not disappear, but isolated themselves in the highlands. Their descendants may have kept the traditions alive in a distorted form." The agent visited the place where, according to legends, their settlement was located, a valley between 2 stone ridges north of Bellingham Creek. The only way to get there was on foot. Accompanied by a local guide, he climbed to a plateau overgrown with coniferous forest. There, among the moss and boulders, were the remains of several stone structures. In the center was a round platform that looked like an altar. On one of the stones, Hale noticed a carved symbol, a triangle with an eye inside. The same symbol was on the amulet found in Clara's hand. Upon returning to the base, he wrote in his diary, "They exist, not as a sect, not as fanatics. They believe in balance. For them, death is not a crime, but a gift. They do not kill, they protect." Testimonies began to come from other residents. One of the shepherds said that he saw lights in the mountains at night, lights that moved slowly, like torches. Another recalled hearing singing, like a low humming sound. "They come when a storm is coming," he said. Anthropologists brought in to investigate confirmed that isolated families who avoid contact do indeed occur in these areas. They hunt, keep livestock, and do not use modern technology. All the descriptions matched: silent, fair-skinned, with deep-set eyes, sometimes appearing near passes and disappearing just as quickly. Hale concluded that these were the people who could have found Clara Mitchell's body after her death. For them, she, a lonely traveler, became the embodiment of the very pure soul that old legends spoke of. They didn't kill her. They raised her to preserve her, performing their rite of eternal vigil. In a report to the FBI headquarters, he wrote, "This is not a criminal organization, but the heirs of a forgotten faith. They are convinced that every storm is a test, and only self-sacrifice can keep the balance. Their actions are part of a ritual ethic, not aggression. They are the keepers of the silence." The investigation continued, but it was already clear. Behind the 10 years of silence was not a criminal secret, but something much older and deeper, a faith that survived among ice, wind, and stone. And perhaps it was this faith, like the mountains, that was not going to disappear. In late August of 2024, Agent Jonathan Hale and an FBI team raided a remote valley between the Sea Hill Mountains and Bellingham Creek. Its coordinates were established after several weeks of satellite surveillance. The images showed faint heat signals, several sources of fire among the rocks and forest, 20 miles from the nearest road. The only way to reach the site was by helicopter or horseback. Agent Hale chose the latter, a 5-day trek through gorges where the wind howled as if someone was singing in the mountains. The team moved slowly, stopping for the night under overhanging stone walls. The closer they got, the more clearly they felt that the valley was alive. With each step, the air grew thicker, as if the silence were becoming tangible. On August 26, when the sun had just risen, the guide who was walking ahead stopped and pointed down. Smoke could be seen down among the conifers. In the center of the clearing were several huts made of rough logs covered with moss. People were moving around one of them, slowly, without haste. They were not running away, not hiding. Hale ordered them not to use weapons. The group went down to the settlement. When they got closer, about 10 people came out of the huts, men, women, and one elderly woman in a white cloak. All of them were barefoot, with bandages on their heads. They stopped in a semicircle and waited in silence. One of the agents tried to speak in English, but only heard a short answer. "We knew you were coming." There were no weapons, electricity, or modern conveniences in the valley. Inside the huts were wooden spoons, wax candles, and clay vessels. On the walls were the same symbols, a triangle with an eye, spirals, and drawings of snow goats. On one of the stone tables was a leather-bound journal. It belonged to Clara Mitchell. The entries were short and uneven. The last dates were August 15th and 16th, 2014. She described how the snow began to fall in the middle of summer, how she lost her bearings and took refuge in a gorge. The last entry was fragmentary. "I am no longer afraid. The forest breathes with me. If I fall asleep, so be it." When the agents began interviewing the valley residents, they did not resist. There were 11 of them, 4 men, 6 women, and an elder called Mirren. She spoke slowly, almost in a whisper, and her words were translated by a young woman with a soft accent. "We did not touch her life," Mirren said. "She was already gone when we found her in the snow. We saw the silence in her eyes and realized it was a sign. She had not come by chance." They said that that year a storm destroyed some of their huts and killed their livestock. When the storm subsided, 3 of them went up, looking for the cause of the mountain's anger. In a crevasse near a glacier, they found Clara's body with no visible injuries and a smile on her face. Her diary was lying next to her. "We saw a pure soul," Maureen said, "a woman who did not run away from the cold. We knew that the storm had accepted her, and we had to give her a form of light." They took the body to the cave, prepared it as their ancestors had done, waxed it to keep it clean, folded their arms, and placed an amulet made of mountain goat horn, a symbol of unity with the stone. Hale listened without interrupting. Short lines appeared in his notebook. They consider themselves guardians, not killers. Ritual is a way to maintain balance. For them, death is not the end, but service. Experts who accompanied the agents recorded that the people in the settlement had lived separately for at least several generations. Their genes had almost no contact with the outside world. Everyone was born here in the valley. They did not know about modern politics, electricity, or the internet. The only thing they were interested in was changes in the weather. Every storm had meaning for them. Every death had significance. Hale contacted the FBI to report on the situation. In his report, he stated, "The settlement is not a threat. The people are not aggressive, nor do they show signs of mental illness. Their actions are part of an isolated religious practice. They did not kill the woman. They only performed a rite." Later, the district prosecutor asked him, "And you really believe that this is not a crime?" Hale answered briefly, "For us, it's death. For them, it's a continuation of the balance." A week later, all the residents of the valley were evacuated for medical examination. They agreed without protest. One of the agents recalled, "They were saying goodbye to the mountains as if they were leaving someone alive." Everyone bent their heads, touched the ground, and then walked away without looking back. Clara Mitchell's case was officially closed in the fall of the same year. The document stated, "The cause of death was natural. No third-party actions. The circumstances are ritualistic." But for many, these words did not sound like an explanation. People began to argue in society. What was it? Reverence for the dead or an outrage against the body? Some people called these people fanatics. Others called them keepers of ancient knowledge. And some believed that there really are places in the mountains where death does not belong to humans, and those who understand this are simply fulfilling the will of nature. Clara Mitchell, a lonely tourist from Washington, D.C., became for them what she never aspired to be: a sign, a sacrifice, and a symbol of peace between man and the mountains. Her story ended where the silence is stronger than the wind. She remained on the altar, not as a sacrifice, but as a talisman against the storm. And in what they called eternal vigil, disappearance turned into peace.